In our last lesson, we saw how unfaithfulness on the part of King Solomon had divided the Jewish nation into separate kingdoms. At this point, following the biblical storyline becomes much more complicated than it was in previous books. You can no longer get the entire story by simply reading one book after the other in the order they appear. In this lesson, I'm going to give you a guided tour of the divided kingdom period as told in the books of Kings and Chronicles, and also brought to life through the prophets. At the end of 1 Kings chapter 11, Solomon's son Rehoboam was made king upon the death of his father. The people were weary with the heavy tax burden levied on them to pay for Solomon's tremendous building projects and supporting his military defenses and lavish lifestyle. Rehoboam had been advised by his elder counselors to provide some relief for the people. Rehoboam instead listened to younger counselors and added to the high tax burden that they were already paying. As a result, a strong man from the north, whose name was Jeroboam, convinced the people that they should no longer remain allegiant to Jerusalem. He set up two more convenient high places near their homes where they could go to worship using golden calves to represent God, a holdover practice from pagan worship rituals. These were abominable to God, and he was continuously displeased with Jeroboam for setting them up. And so, as prophesied during the reign of Solomon, the larger part of the land and people were divided to Jeroboam. The northern tribes abandoned their loyalty to their temple in Jerusalem, to their king, and to the house of David. The fragile union that David cemented had ultimately fractured, never to be repaired. The northern tribes of Israel were led by kings who only loosely held to the ways of the Lord. They held at least equal or even greater allegiance to the pagan gods of the surrounding nations, Baal, Ashtaroth, Molech, and Chemosh. For the remainder of Israel's history, not only a single one of the 19 kings banished this pagan worship from the kingdom. The Davidic dynasty in Judah, however, had a series of 20 kings. A few were faithful to the Lord, while others carried on the pagan habits of their sister state, Israel. Whether or not a king was idolatrous or allowed idolatrous practices became the sole measure of his faithfulness, according to the books of 2 Kings and Chronicles. Would they eliminate the high places and return to the sole worship of the Lord their God, or would they continue in the pagan religious acts of Jeroboam of Israel? They were pronounced good if they followed the ways of David, or evil if they followed in the ways of Jeroboam. In general, God looked favorably upon the Judeans at times when they were under the leadership of a good king, and they tended to prosper. Also, the king himself was generally longer-lived if he led the people away from idolatry. During times of paganism, there were a few great reformer kings over Judah who vanquished all the false gods from the land. Among them, the most prominent were Hezekiah and Josiah. In the end, even though Josiah's efforts to reform Judah were noble, the reforms proved to be only superficial as he failed in turning the hearts of the people back to the Lord. Imagine with me, if you will, what the pagan impact must have been on God, who created their nation from a single man, showed great signs and wonders in the wilderness to preserve them, and led them in their conquest of the land to call their own, and put down their oppressors. And now they are firmly established as a nation under the guidance of kings. They are led back into the very idolatry that resulted in the destruction of the previous nations that occupied Canaan. If you just want to get the basic historical storyline of the Old Testament, you could just read from Joshua to Judges to Samuel to Kings. The information contained in the Chronicles and Prophets can then be used as supplemental to this storyline. Here are some helpful pointers. First, in this storyline, the kingdom divides north and south in 1 Kings 12. Second, how do you tell the history of two nations at the same time? The writer of Kings goes back and forth between the two. The writer will focus on one nation for a while and then change over to the other for a while. He goes back in time to catch up on one nation and then passes the point where he left off with the other, so that there's a lot of overlap between the two. The books of Kings also stop along the way to give narratives of several prophets, especially Elijah and his apprentice Elisha. After you have read through the books of Kings, if you then read through the books of Chronicles, you'll begin to see that a lot of the same information is there, but there are many differences. For example, Chronicles is more of a summary work. The prophets are hardly mentioned, and the reputations of the kings seem to be cleaned up a little bit. The divided kingdom period is rich in histories of leaders of God's people at their best and worst. The books of Kings are filled with the narratives of colorful people. Most of the kings are mentioned in the slightest detail, while others are much more well-developed characters. Examples of a few that get the most attention represent both ends of the spectrum: Jeroboam, the prototypical bad king; Ahab, the worst of the worst, and his wife Jezebel, who was worse than he; and Jehu, all kings of Israel. You will also read more about some of the kings of Judah, Joash and Ahaz, then a good reformer king who made some questionable decisions. His name was Hezekiah, and another good reformer king named Josiah. Among the most colorful characters were not only kings, but also some of the prophets. More detail is given about a few prophets than we know about most of the kings. Most of that attention is captured by Elijah and then Elisha. However, there are also interesting narratives about a disobedient prophet who is not even named, and another by the name of Ahijah who spoke against Jeroboam. In 2 Kings chapter 17 and verse 6, generally dated at 721 or 722 BC, the kingdom of Israel and its capital city of Samaria fell to the brutal armies of the Assyrians. The Assyrians had dominated the region since around 900 and were at the height of their power. They destroyed the armies of Israel and had subdued much of Judah, yet through God's providence, Jerusalem remained. Those from Israel who were not killed in battle were carried away captive to Assyria. Based on historical knowledge of the way the Assyrians treated their captives, it was surely destined to be a miserable captivity. Sennacherib, king of Assyria, repopulated Israel with a mixture of peoples. This would prevent the land from lying fallow and also make it unlikely to pull together any kind of military alliance against them. But Assyria would go on to have problems of its own. In 625 BC, the Babylonian governor, Nabopolassar, declared independence from Assyrian rule. This led to a series of unsuccessful military attacks to bring him back into submission to Assyria. The Babylonian and Median armies joined forces to attack the Assyrian capital of Nineveh in 621 BC. Assyria fell to Babylonia, establishing Babylon as the new dominant power. The kings of Judah, rather than returning to God in faithfulness, turned to the Babylonian kings to try to win their favor. King Hezekiah invited Babylonian envoys to view his kingdom and showed them all his treasures. Isaiah prophesied to Hezekiah that the Babylonians would never forget, but that they would return with armies to destroy Jerusalem, carry away the inhabitants, including Hezekiah's own children, and leave nothing behind. This is exactly what happened in 587 BC, after a 2-year siege while Judah was under the reign of King Zedekiah. This would appear to be the end of the story for the Jews. Both the northern and southern nations had been taken captive and dispersed in foreign lands. What are the chances that a nation can recover from such destruction and dispersion? But God had made a promise. There are a few major messages from this period in history that are emphasized by the writings. First, God admits to being a jealous God for the loyalty of his people. He despises idols. In these chapters, idolatry refers specifically to paganism. But in the New Testament, the meaning of idolatry extends to anything that can take the place of God in the affections of his people. Wealth, education, social status, power, possessions such as houses, automobiles, electronic gadgetry, or clothing. These things may not be wrong in and of themselves, but they make poor gods. If we center our affections on them, they can lead us to destruction. And of course, pagan gods have always been forbidden to Christians. There is only one true and living God. During this period, the nations of Israel were in a general state of decline. The reason for their decline was their disloyalty to God. Even their wealth was used for corrupt purposes. There were a few people at the time who could see it happening and tried to be the voice of reason, but the people refused to listen to them. They preferred to listen to the voices telling them that everything was going to be okay. The kings surrounded themselves with false prophets and counselors who would tell them what they wanted to hear. That did not prevent their destruction. The only answer to immorality is morality. The only answer to corruption is purification. The only answer to injustice is fair-mindedness. And so their destruction was certain. Why? Because God was still in heaven, he still disapproved, and he would not let them continue to get worse and worse forever. Third, God still had a plan to bring about the Messiah through the seed of Abraham. It was a plan that was unheard of. How could God, through the destruction and exile of both Israel and Judah, still establish his kingdom in Jerusalem and set David back on his throne? How could the Messiah come out of a complete demolition of the temple? Join us again next time. We will begin to search for answers to these questions.